Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Guys, could you please introduce yourselves, what you're currently working on, and if you were starting a company in cybersecurity, where would you be most excited to start a company?
Yeah, this is Jamie. I'm CTO at Endgame, and I'm working on endpoint security technologies. I think the space that I'm most interested in right now is primarily around what can we do to automate a lot. There's a huge kind of skills gap and hiring and retention problem right now in cybersecurity. So how can we make basically the space a lot easier for getting new people into the space and maybe perhaps even lesser skilled and maybe less people in general. So that's some of the places I'm interested in. Cybersecurity is now on kind of the front page of many stories in our society. There's so much more, when I grew up, there wasn't a lot of tech kind of dominating kind of the consumer market and so forth. And so security plays a much bigger role in our everyday lives. So that has led to the need for more skilled people in the space that can help protect the data and so forth. That's obviously the amount of kind of education and skill and just generally trained people has dwarfed kind of the demand that we have in today's society.
So I'm also working on endpoint security at CrowdStrike. My main thesis at the moment is that cyber risk or cybersecurity in general should become securitized and somehow turn into a financially quantifiable risk. So if I were to start a company now, I would try to do it in the cyber insurance space. I think a lot of what we see right now in that space is basically new ways to do sales of insurance products. But I think what's interesting there is figuring out just a very different kind of product and capital structure to bring to the market, because cybersecurity somehow feels one of the few remaining risks that enterprise companies really don't have, for which like enterprise companies don't have a easy financial instrument to protect against, and that seems counterintuitive. Whether we want it or not, everything to what Jamie was saying, everything both in consumer and enterprise will have computers involved, meaning cybersecurity. So just insurance in general will be changed dramatically because of cybersecurity. So I think it's an exciting area to be in.
Yeah, totally. Before getting into some of the specific applications, let's zoom out a little bit. For the smart technologist out there who's looking to build a company in cybersecurity or investors who are looking to determine opportunities, why don't we zoom out first and almost give a little market map? Like cybersecurity is obviously a big term, enormous space. How do you sort of subdivide sort of the main subsectors within cybersecurity?
I'm been focused on endpoint for 21 years. And so it's a little bit.
Can you describe what endpoint is?
Yeah. So I think, Vincenzo might have a slightly different definition with his background, but the endpoint for me is kind of the server, desktop, laptop, that help us do computing in, more of an enterprise environment. Vincenzo has obviously a lot of background in the mobile space. And so, mobiles and endpoint as well, there's different degrees of focus there.
Yeah. I mean, I would define it as basically wearing your software or basically code. Like for me, endpoint is anything that is a computing device where you can have your security product on. I guess network security tends to be something you add to the enterprise like perimeter. So I think that's how I would split it.
As I think of the different categories, kind of cybersecurity, there's a lot of efforts been spent around network security, and then now we're seeing like a big explosion around the kind of endpoint security, and there's identity management, there's deception technologies that are kind of up and coming, there's orchestration platforms that have played a big role more recently in cybersecurity. So those are some of the general categories I think about when I'm looking at the space.
How about you, Vincenzo?
Similar, I think some of the ones that to partially to go back to the insurance topic, there is a lot about like risk and compliance. The access management and data security are also two relatively large areas. And then something that it's going maybe a bit out of fashion right now is threat intelligence, or it's being like it's going through some major changes. And the idea around threat intelligence is that you as a company provide like private information about specific threats that might target your customers. And then there is a vast space that it's application security, and that covers anything from vulnerability assessment to application firewalls to anything that improves the state of a code base, so reduces bugs or enforces some kind of secure development lifecycle. That part of the market is interesting because it is part of security, but it's a very different audience and has very different economics and mechanics than the rest of the space. And there is a bit on the sort of like consumer side for security, but it tends to be, at least today, it tends to be enterprise companies that then move down to consumers as opposed to a pure consumer play in the field. So we're seeing, like we used to see, I guess, Symantec. Now we're starting to see new endpoint security companies trying to go more into the consumer area.
Totally. So in a post where you talked about the opportunities in insurance, you talked about addressing the market for Lemon's problem. Can you say a little bit about what that is and where you think the opportunity within insurance is, where entrepreneurs should be focusing?
Yeah, the problem you have with security products in general is that it's hard to prove their effectiveness. And what's happening a lot these days is that companies are trying to come up with sort of like test environments where you can do proof of values, like tests, to show that actually what you claim is true, and you do actually, I don't know, prevent a specific type of breach, or you do help with a given type of threat. But obviously, it's quite a hard problem to solve in the general case, because again, the idea here is that you're preventing something from happening rather than making something happen. I think for the longest time, because we didn't have a lot of external forces in the market that would try to enforce a more analytical approach to the market for lemon problem. Then a lot of security used to be sort of like a enterprise sales exercise where you would sell into an organization if you knew somebody that had buying power in that organization. I think insurance and regulation to some extent are putting pressure on the sector to show that actually we have measurable ways to improve the state of security for an individual company based on what they buy and what kind of people they hire and so on and so forth. So I think insurance definitely plays a role in making security products more accountable in terms of quantifying their effectiveness.
Have you found any products that are currently working on this, or approaches that you're excited about?
So there is a company that I haven't invested in, but I think is moving, like is going towards that, which is called TackIQ. The idea is that they will try to create, again, simulated environments in which they can reliably measure the effectiveness of a given product based on the claims that the product has. And so that's definitely an interesting company. I think there are a lot of companies that are trying to come up with risk models for cybersecurity, with, again, the idea of making it easier for insurance companies to underwrite policies. But I haven't found anything yet that is particularly exciting, because I think a lot of people are focusing on the like what can you automatically gather from outside of the company, and they are not focusing enough on how do you actually structure this insurance product for something that is ever changing, like a network of an enterprise company. And also, how do you account for a lot of the attacks you see today about like phishing, credential stealing, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, kind of back to the Attack IQ model. I think it's interesting because I'm not an investor. I know some of the investors there and some of the founders, but what I think is interesting about their model is instead of evaluating necessarily the product from the vendor's perspective, they're trying to validate it from the buyer's perspective. So if you're a large corporation, you want to kind of evaluate your security stack, you can, use Attack IQ to help you do that, which is kind of turned the problem, I think, a little bit on its head. I think also in cybersecurity, another place that we haven't quite got it right yet is from evaluating the vendor itself. So kind of really independent third-party validation is difficult to do because the products themselves are expensive to get, there's a lot of money involved. And so kind of that independent third-party validation is a difficult problem that I don't think has completely been solved either.
Vincenzo, one thing you've looked a lot about is intersection between cybersecurity and crypto or blockchain. Can you talk about your interest there and where entrepreneurs and technologists should be focused?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of areas that are interesting either at the intersection of those two things or where you can literally apply things we've learned in one industry to the other. So a few in no particular order. I think the problem of custody in the crypto space is a problem that is quite familiar with the cybersecurity industry, especially for people that used to work in highly classified environments. And so there's definitely quite a lot that can be learned in the cryptocurrency space from that world. I think vice versa, a problem that we failed to solve in cybersecurity, or at least we failed to solve properly in cybersecurity. And it seems like in the cryptocurrency space is doing much better. Is how do you deal and how do you bootstrap distributed trust without having any kind of central parties or trusted parties? And a clear example of that is our certificate authorities. As time goes by, one of the things that the cybersecurity industry is now adopting more and more is this idea that even applications and websites and so on and so forth, they all need to be signed. And security models for most operating systems now rely on this sort of PKI infrastructure. And as a result of that, what we started to see a few years ago, and it's still in progress, is a lot of the certificate authorities would compromise all sorts of very nasty security incidents. The crypto space has figured out really clever ways to deal with situations like that. I'm thinking something like Handshake. And so I think that would definitely be an area where cybersecurity could learn from crypto. Code quality is an area where bugs we've seen in the DAO or just Ethereum in general is because Solidity as a programming language is fundamentally flawed. If somebody from the cybersecurity world, specifically the application security world, was involved in the design choices behind Solidity, I think that would have prevented a lot of the incidents we've seen in the past few years. So I think there are quite, and lastly, the other thing that I find particularly exciting is that a lot of the, latest research in cryptography is happening because of cryptocurrencies. And one area that I find extremely fascinating is zero knowledge proofs. I think that we've now gotten to the point where they are quite usable for a wide range of applications. And I think that the cybersecurity industry has a lot of catching up to do with the cryptocurrency world in terms of how do we use zero knowledge proof for some of the problems that we have around information sharing and so on and so forth. So I think that's another area where a lot of cross pollination could happen between the two industries.
Yeah, I think those are interesting spaces to think about, and how the technologies maybe the knowledge hasn't transferred yet between the two camps, but I know Vincenzo is very interested in that. Kind of in relation to that, kind of those central authorities, kind of a spin-off of that concept from the certificate managers is we still in many ways we have these kind of crunchy perimeters or, solid perimeters and then kind of mushy interior. Like once you get authenticated, then you kind of have authentication throughout the entire domain of whatever that enterprise is doing. Place that is, I think kind of maybe a little bit ahead of itself, but an interesting concept is the authentication between microservices and these dynamic workloads. That's a company that I've been following. A friend of mine founded it. It's called Cytail, I believe is how you pronounce it. But they're trying to authenticate microservices to one another. Instead of having, once you get authenticated in general, then any microservice can talk to any other microservice kind of thing, unless there's a firewall rule. So that's an up and coming area that as we get more distributed computing, as Vincenzo was talking about, that might be an interesting area for investment and more entrepreneurial action there. I was just at Black Hat with Vincenzo and corresponding with more or less a CISO at a very, very large organization. He was kind of mentioning the Cambridge Analytica kind of problem that came up, was in the news recently. And his organization shares a lot of data and brings in a lot of data and so on and so forth. And he was, problem that he kind of raised to a bunch of us that were sitting around the table was like, how do I make sure if I give you my data that you don't then share it or share it in a way that's not approved in our original agreement with another third party. And so, I think there's some things that we could potentially do if you keep the data in-house, but like once it leaves your area, is there something that we could do? Today I don't think blockchain yet solves that problem of kind of the confidentiality, but could we do something that would, if you share that, I would know about it as the originating party of that data. Yeah. And so that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think to what Jamie was saying earlier, I think in general, we haven't really solved the identity management problem, neither at a human level, meaning how do you identify somebody online, but also at the computer level, like how do you make sure that two machines are supposed to communicate and can provide some amount of assurance about their identity and their integrity. And I think doing that at scale has proven challenging, at least so far. And I think that's an area where maybe some of the lessons from cryptocurrencies are interesting. And the other thing about Cambridge Analytica that it's quite interesting is that we are finding ourselves into a situation where a lot of the what seems to be more valuable is the data rather than the code. And fundamentally, we are used to a world where we tend to protect the code rather than data to a large extent. So I think there is an open question of, well, what is the better way to deal with data? Like, how would you solve Cambridge Analytica? And one obvious way would be to say, okay, we should have an app store like model, whereby if you want to touch any of my data, I'm not gonna give the data to you. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run arbitrary computation on my network to do something with the data, which is very counterintuitive to people that have done security for a long time, because we have this immediate connection in our head that arbitrary computation on somebody else's machine is bad. And so I think dealing with the problem of metadata tracking or data tracking that does not involve flipping the equation between data and code is an area where maybe cryptocurrencies could play, or lessons learned from cryptocurrencies could play a role. Although I think it's to what Jamie was saying, I don't think there is a clear solution out there yet.
Yeah. Going back to what, James, you were saying in your introduction about the education problem, because you also wrote a little bit about you're interested in entrepreneurs who are tackling the continuous education problem. Can you talk a little bit about where you see opportunity there, where you want to see innovation?
So I'm actually an investor in this company. There's a company called Immersive Labs that tries to fix that problem. I think today in security, we have a couple of issues. One is there's just a lot of demand and very little supply for people that have a security background. And so what happens is if you're a company below like a Fortune 500, your security staff is probably not particularly well trained. And then what happens is you have one of two options, or one of three options. One, either you spend top dollars on talent, and that probably does not make sense given your size, or you outsource it to a sort of like security provider. They tend to be called managed security service providers. And basically those are big organizations to whom you kind of like outsource your cybersecurity. Or what you do is you hire people that don't necessarily have a security background, and then you sort of like try to bring them up to speed. I think this last group is the most promising one from a security education standpoint, and also more in general. I think we find ourselves in a interesting space right now where a lot of the security that we're used to is changing significantly, partially because of cloud adoption, but partially because sort of like software vendors are taking security more seriously, which means that where we do security and on what we do security will change dramatically. And so I think there is a need for everyone, even like veterans in the field, to stay up to date. The ability to have a sort of like continuous learning platform is, I think, at least for now, is absolutely necessary. And what this company is doing specifically is they do capture the flag style contest to make sure that you're actually learning concept in a practical way. I think that area where like you try to give people a measurable and concrete set of skills is particularly needed in the industry right now.
Yeah, and just to touch on kind of that managed security service model, it's been around for a while. I would say there's maybe we're seeing a little bit more appetite for it of recent. There's some of the larger players like a Dell SecureWorks or a Symantec or something like that have been doing it for a good number of years. But, kind of looking around the market, there's probably another 20 or so boutiques, smaller, that have begun, over the last 2 or 3 years in this space. And, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think there's a certain appetite for it, even in corporations that are, have a lot of revenue, where they want to have the best people that they can afford. And at the same time, they want to give them the most challenging, interesting problems that are kind of pertinent to the organization. And so some of the outsourcing that we may see will be to automate and get rid of some of the more mundane tasks in cybersecurity and some of the things that perhaps should be a little bit easier to do. And that way they can still challenge their existing staff and keep them excited about the job and not have to hire necessarily quite as many people if they can find a good partner on the outside. We saw this, I worked at Mandiant for a number of years, and we saw that in some of the managed services that they provided where, if you would look at these corporations that were the customer, some of them were definitely able to afford and hire and have the very best talent possible because of their revenue and so forth. But they decided to specialize in what they did and instead, outsource some of their security tasks, which, it's interesting. And kind of back to what Vincenzo was talking about with kind of your risk model and so forth, that, obviously changes the equation a little bit, because in some of those scenarios, you're, in talking about the compute going to the data, in this case, a lot of these managed security providers, the data actually goes to them. So you have to have perhaps a little bit more risk tolerance, or definitely make sure that, you're in compliance with things like GDPR and so forth.
Jamie, I want to ask, if you were 100% focused on running a fund, focused on cybersecurity investing, I want to ask, what your thesis would be, but sort of as a pre-question to that, I'm curious, because you've been in the space for a couple decades plus, how do you sort of contextualize the current era? Is this like the golden age of cybersecurity startups? I mean, given sort of the surge of, data security breaches in last year, Equifax, Cambridge Analytica, others, how do you sort of contextualize this current moment as it relates to the past 2 decades sort of for the opportunity?
First off, I think I'm the worst person to ask about kind of cyber invest because I've been in it so long. I'm pretty much a curmudgeon about it all. But I'll tell you some of my thoughts about it. I think that, this kind of surge and, breaches and so forth, I think it does present a lot of opportunity for some new ideas to come into the space and to have very successful companies, build very successful companies. We shouldn't be surprised by this, as just been in the space 21 years. And as things have progressed, we talked about earlier, kind of like now our computing and digitalization of our data and so forth is like prevalent in everything we do, whether go to the doctor or, have a easy pass for the roads and so forth. Like there's just so much information out there and it affects our lives every day. And, both nation states and, cyber criminals or what have you have identified that as a great opportunity for them as well. Right. So they're, making more and more strides in order to monetize that data and so forth. And they've come up with some, ingenious ways to do that. So I think it is maybe the golden era, perhaps, of cybersecurity. However, nothing's new under the sun. Like, we used to call deception networks, honeypots, a decade ago or whatever. There isn't a whole lot of brand new ideas. There's definitely iterations on the ideas to make them better. And so I think one, cautionary tale is like if you're an entrepreneur or really even investors, there's a lot of competition in the space. So, and it doesn't really matter. Like you'll see, I think maybe 4 years ago or so, we saw like deception networks kind of pop up on the horizon. And now I could probably name about 10 that do it. Maybe there's probably a lot more that, will show up at RSA or somewhere next year. So it is a crowded, cybersecurity in general is a crowded market, regardless of what you do. You might think it's totally new, but, as soon as you announce, usually there's at least 3 other competitors there immediately. So that's, makes it interesting for both an entrepreneur and investor, but maybe that's just because I'm old and in the space.
I was going to say, I think to a large extent, cybersecurity tends to be an execution game rather than like a novelty game. You rarely see something on the market that it's mind-blowingly novel. What you do see is something that as a concept has existed for a long time, but then finally is packaged up in a sort of like very usable way. And I think honeypots are a very good example. There is this company called Canary that effectively has honeypots, but they're packaged in a very simple to install hardware device that you just drop in your perimeter. And that has driven adoption. So the ease of use has driven adoption massively. I would say, sort of like when I look at companies to invest, I think one of the mistakes a lot of entrepreneurs make in this sector is they have an hypothesis as of whether what they do would actually solve a problem, but they think a lot about building that, and they don't think enough about building a way to actually prove that their hypothesis is true, which goes back to the proof of value problem that there is. That said, I do think that we are in a golden age for security for a simple reason. I think we finally reached the point where the vast majority of the population has spent a significant amount of their time online, which means that all the problems you used to have maybe, I don't know, hundreds of years ago in the physical world are now popping up in this, let's call it the cyber world or the internet. And so as such, as we've gone through many decades and centuries of figuring out how do we solve crime on the street and how do we prevent, I don't know, pirates and that sort of stuff, all of that is coming up in a different shape on the internet. And so from that standpoint, I do think that we are in a golden age for cyber, but it's extremely competitive to Jamie's point.
Yeah, Vincenzo, what would be your thesis if you were solely focused on a cybersecurity fund in terms of, besides what we talked about, where would you be most excited or where thematically would you be excited, and where thematically would you say, I don't want to touch any companies that are doing this or in this space, or this is just too either a solved problem or too overcrowded or too difficult?
Yeah, so I wouldn't touch at the moment. One is endpoint security. And the reason why I wouldn't touch it is, one is because it's extremely crowded, and two, because the new incumbents are of the smart kind. And so like right now, if you look at companies like Endgame or CrowdStrike, they are sort of like the new incumbent, and they're in this situation where like they're eating older companies' lunch, like, I don't know, Symantec, McAfee, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, they're still in that sort of like startup-like stage where they can fend off competition really well. So I think getting into anything endpoint is almost impossible at this point. The other area that I would be really wary of is network security, especially traditional network security, because I think what Docker and containers plus the cloud is doing to networks will significantly change the shape of an enterprise perimeter. And now we are in this hybrid phase where it hasn't happened yet, but it's definitely going to happen. So the product you will deploy, like the product you will build today for a fully sort of like cloud containerized world is not going to sell well now. But if you build a product in network security that sells well today, you won't be able to survive tomorrow. So I think that's an area that I'd be concerned about. And then in terms of like,
as you mentioned it earlier, Vincenzo, I think like kind of the threat intelligence space is kind of on the decline. I think it makes a great addition to a company, to help like kind of enrich the data that you already have and provide some insights around it. But strictly a pure play, like we're going to sell you a list of bad hashes and IP addresses and domain names isn't really as viable now, because we've seen it commoditized and kind of prices driven to the ground.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think on the positive, and the other thing I would say about threat intelligence is that what it turns out that most companies don't actually have much of a use. Like, it doesn't matter whether they know that like North Korea hacked them or is about to hack them, or might hack them, because that's not actionable enough. So I think that the main problem that a lot of the threat intelligence companies have is that it's very hard to make their insight actionable. And also, to a large extent, everyone ends up having the same insights, so it's hard to differentiate yourself. I think on the positive side, aside from what we talked about earlier, so the cyber insurance, the education and blockchain / security, I think one area that I find promising is anything related to identity management and just simplification of some of the infrastructure that we have that has been around for decades now. I mean, we've talked quite a lot about sort of like PKIs and certificate authorities, but in general, I think stuff like Kerberos or Active Directory are systems that every organization has, and they're extremely complicated to manage. They're the source of a lot of data breaches. And so I think it's something that allows an enterprise to completely do away without them, would be quite an interesting area to look more into. But it's a really tough problem to crack. And I don't know if, Jamie, you have an area that you think is particularly interesting.
Yeah, right now I'm looking a lot at kind of there's that managed space, a little bit of the educational side, but a little bit probably more toward the managed space. And how can we make that better? Because I think it's an execution game, as Vincenzo was speaking to earlier, where the large incumbents really haven't executed well. And so I think it's interesting. It's a little bit more techy, but I think it's an interesting space.
Yeah, and one last thing I would add is the anti-fraud space, I think, will soon become very interesting because we are seeing a lot of improvements in AI/machine learning, whereby it's going to be quite easy to fake stuff like voice or video and so on and so forth. And how we deal with those problems is an open question. And also kind of related to this, a lot of the Cambridge Analytica type of events show us that cybersecurity is partially moving away from problems about computers to problems about people's psychology. And as an industry, we are absolutely unprepared to deal with that. So it feels like an area where there will be a lot of work and a lot of interesting action.
Yeah. If you guys had to, we've talked a lot about the past and the present, but if you had to project out to the future a little bit, whether it's 5 years out, 10 years out, maybe even 20 years out, how do you sort of see the space evolving over time and the opportunities evolving over time? Project out a little bit, paint a picture for what you expect to see or what we might see.
Yeah, I'll just pick up kind of what Vincenzo was saying. If we play out kind of that scenario, like where you can fake data, right? Like if I can get a video of you for 5 minutes or 20 minutes, and then I can create any video I want of you saying anything I want, that has some really interesting implications for our society. We saw what can happen when kind of data is manipulated to bifurcate kind of the public opinion, right? With the Facebook things and so forth during the election. And so if, as Vincenzo maybe alluded to, kind of this video and audio in kind of almost a real-time manner that looks seamless. And then, how do we know this person really said that and things like that? That is a whole new kind of, quote unquote, identity type of problem. How do we know that this really happened? So whereas, when radio and things first came on the scene, it was amazing because public figures could address, their entire country, perhaps the world, and galvanize, kind of people around a common cause. But if we, now that the technology is advancing, if you look at is I don't know if it'll be 5 years, but that's kind of might be a strange new world where security would have to challenge or conquer a lot of new challenges.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think so. The other area that I think will be quite interesting to watch and witness is I think we're getting much better at securing individual components, but we're starting to get very close to basically combinatorial explosion of stuff that is connected to each other. And so when you start to look at the latest data breaches, what you see is that it tends to be a few years ago, what you would normally see is, there is exploit for a browser, and that exploit for a browser compromises a machine, and then from that machine, they sort of do what in the industry terms is called lateral movement, meaning they figure out what other machines nearby in the network they can compromise and so on and so forth. A lot of what we're seeing these days is basically you compromise one of the weaker links in your supply chain or whatever else that is still connected to you, and then you sort of escalate from there. So I think we will see a lot more of these attacks where you attack you attack targets that have no utility to you in themselves, except their privileged access to the organization that you actually care about. That world will look very different from what we're used to defend against today. That's definitely an area that's interesting. And also, back to what Jamie was saying, I think what we are unprepared to deal with is the concept that what we see and hear is not true. And so anything that deals with that is going to be, dealing with that is going to be an ongoing concern and problem that we literally have no idea how to tackle.
On that ominous note, thank you guys. This has been an awesome episode. Where can people find you or learn more about your work online? What's one thing you want entrepreneurs, investors to take away from this podcast, whether it's a summary of something we've discussed or something we haven't yet mentioned?
I'm kind of pretty easy to find online. You can Google me. I have a Twitter account, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. I would say, to the entrepreneurs out there, maybe this wasn't the most encouraging talk, but I think, it's probably been said on the podcast before, but, I think being a practitioner, like doing this every day, even if you're kind of a beginner, is a great place to start. Be the operator who's trying to solve security problems. And then I think as you get exposed to more and more of those issues, that's what will prompt, your unique idea or your, how you can execute better than some of the incumbents, by solving a real problem that's been a pain point for yourself. So, I'm a big believer in kind of, on the job experience and so forth. And so I think by being that operator or security person, like more from a management policy operations side of things, is a great place to start before you set out to go build something.
Yeah, for me, similar. I have a Twitter account. I'm pretty easy to find online on LinkedIn. I think in terms of advice to entrepreneurs is, I keep going back to what I was saying earlier. I think security is too much of a market for lemons. So I would focus on building something that can be measured. And I would also focus a lot on figuring out, do you build the product, also building the proof. And for investors, I think what is counterintuitive in security is that what is needed today in the enterprise, it's likely not going to be needed 5 years down the line. And so I think the areas that are most promising are, like, I guess a method that is good to find what's promising is to look at what is the current and latest state of the art as far as, research or software development goes, and what is the state of enterprise security. And if you find an area where the current state of the art has not improved and enterprise security has that problem today, that's probably a good place to invest for the next 5 to 10 years. A concrete example is investing today in a company that stops software exploits is probably not a good idea, because we've gotten to a point when you look at modern Windows or iOS where writing an exploit is still feasible, but it's economically unfeasible for the vast majority of actors. So a company that solves that, like, tail risk probably doesn't have enough customers to run a real business. But you wouldn't be able to tell that today just by looking at the state of enterprise security and and what you see in the news about data breaches, because it's all about like exploit and WannaCry and all of that.
Totally. Guys, thank you for coming on. This has been a great episode.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.